Welcome back to the course Cooperative Individualism, the third way to the just society. We've reached lesson 10. The title of this lesson is Neither Left Nor Right. Is there any doubt today that people are quite divided over very fundamental questions of how we ought to organize ourselves and what are our rights and duties, if any? Within the United States, the ideological frame of reference used by politicians and citizens alike to label an individual or a proposal is based on the terms liberal, progressive, and conservative. Given the long tradition attached to these socio-political labels, we apply them without much conscious thought. Yet many of us who might willingly describe ourselves with one of these 2 or 3 labels are ourselves unsure of what we have in common with others who do likewise. In a very general way, being a liberal is thought to suggest approval of government intervention to promote an equality of treatment for all individuals under the Constitution. A liberal is also thought to advance the cause of equality of opportunity, or to a greater or lesser degree, equality of result, where the distribution of personal wealth and income are concerned. A conservative, on the other hand, is thought to favor a far more narrow interpretation of the federal government's responsibilities in the protection of civil liberties or pursuit of equality objectives, assigning these issues to the prerogative of the states. In point of fact, these seemingly clear distinctions tell us very little. Except for those individuals whose writings, statements, or actions put them clearly outside the mainstream, there is considerable crossover by self-described liberals and conservatives on many policy issues. Often, an individual's ideological rhetoric conflicts markedly with the type of policy initiatives pursued when holding political office or serving in some advisory capacity. One reason for such inconsistencies is that our socio-political arrangements and institutions serve to mitigate and limit the range of policies around which a consensus can be built. There is a remarkably homogeneous value system holding Americans together despite the nation's tremendous diversity in ethnic, religious, and racial makeup. The everyday challenges of settling a continent, building an industrial base, and absorbing an endless stream of immigrants from all over the globe did create a nation very different in circumstance from what the framers of the Constitution ever foresaw. Despite a strong bias in favor of the propertied and a concentration of local and national power in the hands of a select number of families, those born in America who came here during the 19th century adhered to the romantic notion that the playing field in America was, if not perfectly level, more level than anywhere else. Not until the late 19th century did American institutions come under direct attack by reformers and agitators championing causes similar to those the old world hierarchy wrestled with much earlier. The reform movement was initiated in the United States by a strange coalition of labor organizers, social scientists, professional managers, women fighting for the right to vote, and educators. They came together under the banner of progressivism. At the same time in the 20th century, an enlarged coalition that included enlightened industrialists and public officials, community activists, academics, and others forged what has been called liberalism. In essence, liberalism arose as the art of the possible across a broad range of policy areas. As a practical matter, liberalism embraced the idea that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Throughout most of the 19th century, the accepted role of government was to facilitate private interests. This was the age of unbridled individualism and, in its later stage, of monopoly capitalism. In the last 2 decades of that century, a growing number of thoughtful individuals began to take stock of the system's shortcomings and consequences. They united against the excesses that had despoiled the public domain and created a large and growing underclass of propertyless farm and industrial workers. By the early 20th century, their efforts were rewarded in subtle but important changes in public opinion and in the use of government to regulate private interests. When those who had operated virtually uncontrolled for so long finally understood what was at stake, they inched toward compromises that softened some of the outward conditions of poverty and oppression their enterprises had contributed to, but used their wealth and power to make sure change would be incremental and largely to their benefit. Americans were unwilling to consider nationalization of land or industry as proposed by European socialists or Russian Marxists. The spirit, if not the reality, of individual liberty remained one of the nation's strengths. There was, however, great concern among leading citizens over the appearance in the United States of old world problems. Progressives clamored for reforms in child labor laws, for government supportive education, for the construction of hospitals, for clean drinking water and sanitation systems, and for a whole range of programs thought unnecessary or intrusive by earlier generations. Widespread unemployment in the 1930s opened the door to even more direct government intervention in the private affairs of individuals and businesses. Beginning with this period, both the Republican and Democratic parties advanced increasingly interventionist programs designed to reduce the social and political tensions between economic classes. The Second World War, the post-war anti-communist crusade, the civil rights movement, the rise of feminism and environmentalism all contribute to the great enlargement of government enterprise and to the politics of liberalism that dominated American politics until the beginning of the 1980s. Liberalism functions on the basis of compromise and a blend of policy choices in 6 key areas identified here. However, liberalism itself is not a socio-political philosophy, but crosses the boundaries between cooperative individualism and other theoretical systems of societal organization. There is a balance between positive law and natural law that liberalism attempts to achieve in these areas: security versus liberty, redistribution versus natural distribution, policy-driven versus market-driven, positive constraints versus moral and ethical constraints, centralized authority versus decentralized authority, and delegated democracy versus participatory democracy. Under liberalism, full equality of opportunity cannot be realized. The securing of liberty is in fact prevented under liberalism by the degree to which privilege, that is, sanctioned inequality, dominates socio-political arrangements. The chart identifies and describes the 5 important theoretical forms of socio-political systems. As shown, liberalism operates to a greater or lesser degree under policies associated with either cooperative individualism, state socialism, and communitarianism. The greater the policy emphasis on security, that is, order, on redistribution, on policy-driven economic activity, or the use of man-made law to control individual behavior, on centralized authority, and on representative, that is, delegated democracy, the stronger will be the pull toward a system of state socialism. Conversely, policies adopted in the direction of maximizing individual liberty, natural distribution, market, that is, non-coercive win-win economic relationships, ethical constraints on behavior, decentralized authority, and maximum citizen participation in government will pull a society toward cooperative individualism. Movement too far to the left in these policy areas supplants liberalism with harsher forms of state socialism and potentially totalitarianism. Policies implemented beyond the bounds of cooperative individualism pull societies into what are historically uncharted waters. There, human nature collides with the degree of cooperation and selfishness demanded under communitarianism or anarchy. An important point to take notice of is that socio-political arrangements allowing natural law to freely operate may create equality of condition, but cannot generate equality of opportunity. Only cooperative individualism, by prohibiting sanctioned inequalities to occur, establishes the conditions necessary for equality of opportunity to flourish. Equality of opportunity is accomplished by protecting individual liberty from the exercise by others of criminal and economic licenses. As John Locke observed, this requires the establishment of government. Thomas Paine provides the important insight that only by association with others does the individual thrive. Separate an individual from society and give him an island or a continent to possess, and he cannot acquire personal property. He cannot be rich. All accumulation, therefore, of personal property beyond what a man's own hands produce is derived to him by living in society, and he owes on every principle of justice, of gratitude, and of civilization a part of that accumulation back again to society from whence the whole came. Consistent with Paine's ethical mandate, another important characteristic of cooperative individualism is that the natural distribution of wealth to its producers be protected by positive law. Such laws as they relate to property will clearly distinguish between the assets and values we produce and those assets and values attributable to privilege. Cooperative individualism treats the control over nature, whether by deed or lease, as a form of privilege or economic license. Justice requires that the holder of such an economic license fully compensates society for this privilege according to the economic advantage extended. By removing privilege from the societal structure, the control over nature and over capital goods will tend to become almost universal, requiring that those who own or otherwise control nature compensate society based on the full economic value. The rent associated with such ownership or control means that the hoarding of land and natural resources for speculative gain will no longer be profitable and will disappear as a deadweight on market forces. Where only the goods we produce by our labor and use of capital goods is recognized as individual wealth, the result is what political economists describe as a labor and capital goods theory of property. Wealth belongs to its producer. Deeds to land and natural resources, as well as licenses that limit competition, are forms of privilege, the exchange value of which is created by the nation's willingness to uphold these claims under law. To the extent that government fails to collect these values for the benefit of the entire society, the people of a society suffers from a redistribution of wealth, from producers to those who simply claim what is produced on the basis of privilege. The securing of liberty and its protection requires the establishment of government. However, a strong argument can be made against the formation of large nation states based on their historical tendency to protect monopoly privileges with highly coercive and oppressive police powers. Cooperative individualism works to secure and protect individual liberty by maximizing citizen participation in government and by preventing monopolies in both property and political power. As a result, Much of the societal conflict associated with other socio-political systems is mitigated by the high level of cooperation generated when individual initiative is rewarded in direct proportion to the effort expended. I submit that an objective study of past and current societal arrangements support my contention that cooperative individualism provides the only means to secure ourselves and future generations the benefit of a fundamentally just society. To recap briefly, an essential characteristic of cooperative individualism, distinct from all other societal structures, is that property-related law would be consistent with the principle that only those assets produced by labor and capital goods are to be treated as individual property. Nature, as a moral principle, cannot be owned by individuals or entities. This is not to suggest that the owner of property has a right to unrestricted use of such property. Common sense rules, adopted by democratic process, are essential to the establishment of healthy communities within a just society. Cooperative individualism nurtures participatory democracy, as citizens will have the time and resources to permit civic involvement at a level either not permitted under a totalitarian or state socialist regime, or not institutionalized within a communitarian or anarchic society. Because all persons have the same species-specific survival needs, as well as the need for the goods necessary for a decent human existence, we all possess rights, the protection of which is a fundamental societal obligation and commitment. To the cooperative individualist, our humanness is the basis for our rights. A just distribution of wealth in a society exists only when the exchange value of claims to nature, that is rents, are socialized, while the earned wages of labor and legitimate returns to invested capital goods are protected as private wealth. The bottom line of this revamped analysis of what is often referred to as a left-right paradigm is that justice is impossible under systems with characteristics to the left of cooperative individualism. Those who embrace either communitarianism or anarchism must be considered very optimistic about the potential self-control of members of our species. And now we've reached the end of Lesson 10.